Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Diamond 6 webinar on the Corona crisis, leading during the Corona crisis, how to lead through the chaos with a clear plan and decisive action. Thank you all so much for registering and for joining us this evening. And we're going to be really transparent here. We are also self-quarantined at Jeff's house. And so this is what it looks like. Here in his office. Also going to be very transparent that we live here with a 3.5-year-old toddler, so you may hear some sounds in the background, but we're doing the best that we can in that capacity. But this is real life, so this is what it is. So again, I wanted to welcome you. Thank you for being here. We were overwhelmed with the number of registrations and attendees this evening. So it seems like we've obviously hit on a nerve and something that everyone is really needing at the moment, which is some guidance and some clarity on what to do, particularly if you lead an organization. Jeff is going to present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will finish the hour with a Q&A. You can submit questions at any point throughout the presentation by clicking the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting those. I will be collecting those throughout the presentation, and then I will read them for Jeff to answer to finish out the hour, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. Also, bear with us. We've practiced a lot, and we think this is going to go pretty smoothly, but like I said, this is real life, and we're doing the best that we can on our end. And again, thank you all for being here. We're going to shuffle a few things around to bring up Jeff's PowerPoint presentation, and then I will turn it over to him. All right, so hang on just a second here. Give me a chance to. Okay. All right, I'm going to shrink this up for you. All right.
Well, thanks very much, Tanya, and thank you all once again for joining us. I have to say at the onset, I'm a bit intimidated, as Tanya suggested. You know, this whole event occurred based on a chance conversation that I had with my staff and a subsequent discussion I had with a client who thought giving a talk like this on how leaders might think about dealing with this crisis could be useful. And I was thinking about this, and it personally reminded me of something that happened to me back in November of 1990. I was a battalion commander of about 700 soldiers, and we had gotten orders to prepare to deploy from Germany to Saudi Arabia, something we were only totally unprepared to do because there was never a plan for us, in fact, to do that. So as that plan began to unfold very rapidly, we prepared to move. I was confronted by an evening event where we brought together all the soldiers' wives and many, many of their children in a big theater for me to talk to them about how we were going to care for the families, obviously, who were staying behind, and what might happen ahead, and opened up to questions. So I went through my presentation and then took questions, and the first person to ask a question, I never will forget, was a young woman, a wife of a young soldier, and as I recall, she was holding a baby at that time when she stood up, and she asked the very first question. I distinctly remember what that question was. What is going to happen, and how long will you all be gone? Obviously, I had no real answer to that question, as important as it was and critical as it was to her at that particular moment. But I sought to answer it for her as honestly and credibly as I could. And I thought about her as I was preparing this particular presentation, because fundamentally, I would think, once again, as leaders deal with this, they have to deal with it and answer those questions for their team as honestly and credibly as they can. Now, some of you may have known very little about Diamond 6 or even nothing about Diamond 6. Again, we were surprised about the number of people who signed up, who learned about this by word of mouth. A number of clients passed it out, and we thank them for that, to their memberships, and others who just learned about it from Facebook or friends. But in essence, what we are is a very small company that does executive leadership workshops for corporations and public service organizations. We work a lot with the leadership teams from some fantastic school districts, for example, all across the United States. So to quickly acquaint you with us, I guess the easiest way is to show you our mission statement and our vision statement. And it seemed to me, again, that I am not a doctor or a clinician, so I can't provide that kind of expertise tonight on how long or how severe this medical challenge is going to be. I cannot offer real solutions or panaceas, but from our mission statement and vision statement, I devised a purpose, which seemed to me to be the following. As you see, provide leaders a conceptual framework as they deal with the corona crisis and the potential implications for their organization for the future. Because I'm convinced, clearly, and I think we'll all agree, this is a national crisis for all of us. I believe right now, at least, it's unpredictable. Frankly, as a virus, hard to detect, and certainly very difficult for us to ascertain all the implications as we move on into the future. So to begin with, I thought, well, how can I best describe this? I thought, well, let me look at these 7 different ways a leader should react or respond, I guess. And forgive the alliteration, but it seemed to be an effective way perhaps to provide some ability to remember. So here's the things I think a leader should think about: how to reassure, react, demonstrate resilience, utilize effectively my resources, relearn from my organization along the way, confront the reality, and reassess and reflect as you're going along. It might be a good idea to frame that particular problem again in this approach by thinking about what a crisis is. And what a crisis is, I think, is in some ways best described by the symbol you see on the right, which is the Chinese written word for the word crisis. And a number of you probably have heard me talk about this before because I use it a lot. In written Chinese, they often bring together 2 words to create a new word. And that's what they did for crisis, and they bring together 2 words. One is danger. We can all certainly agree with that. There is certainly a certain amount of danger. We all know that surrounding the ongoing corona pandemic. But second of all is opportunity. And I think thinking about it in those terms already provides perhaps a leader's way to think about this particular effort as he or she is moving ahead. With that as an intro, let me move on. Let's begin with the first one, reassure. How do I reassure my team? Well, I think it encapsulates a whole bunch of things, but of course, reassurance is, as you see, an action of removing someone's doubts or fears. Probably not going to remove them, probably going to reduce them to some degree. This depends on a couple of things. First of all, to use a very sexy, perhaps sociological or psychological term, idiosyncratic credits, which are an accumulation of positively disposed impressions residing in the perception of relevant people, those being your particular team, and the degree to which an individual, then the leader in this case, can deviate from the common expectations of the group based on their belief in him or her. Fundamentally, what am I talking about? I'm talking about trust. And all the things that you've done, if you've been in a leadership role for a significant period of time, has built up a certain amount of trust in your organization, in your team. This is fundamental. And how you maintain their trust and build on that trust at this difficult moment is going to help you enormously as you move ahead. In that regard, I would suggest the following. Information is key, as your team will often believe that you know more than you actually do about what's going to happen. I found that to be very common in all the crises that I dealt with. Consequently, regular updates and assurances through information outlets are key. Unfortunately, we don't have the constant flow of information that we normally have in a crisis, which is derived from constant communications and close contact. So we've got to think now about new ways to communicate to the team, enhance our transparency, and keep everybody on board in terms of the direction that the organization is moving. As you do that, you've got to balance out 2 things you see there at the bottom, a balance between optimism and realism. You've got to maintain your credibility. If you make a mistake, my best recommendation would be admit it and move on. Your group is not going to be, and team are not going to be any more optimistic than you are. They will get to your level of optimism. They will rarely exceed it. but certainly, and I'll talk more about optimism a number of times throughout this presentation, that is going to be key to the organization getting through this particular experience. Because certainly we all know that credibility, once lost, is very difficult to recover. Let me move on for a second now and talk a bit more about emotional intelligence. What do we mean by emotional intelligence? Well, all the things you see here. First of all, you as a leader have got to be self-aware of yourself. This is going to be the marathon and not the 50-yard dash. And I'm going to talk about that more a little bit later on as well. You've got to think self-regulation. And as you become personally disturbed, you see I say they're the weepy leader. Well, it could be the angry leader. If you get upset, do so privately. If you get upset, go in your office, close the door, kick the trash can, whatever it takes, but then reestablish your composure and move on. Self-motivation obviously is key, and I'm confident, knowing most of you, that will not be very, very difficult for a lot of you at least. Empathy is key. Think about that spouse I was talking to back in November of 1990. Try to oftentimes look at this problem or aspects of the problem from the perspective of your individual teammates. You may have to show patience for certain individuals because each of them have got their own personal problems, which are derivatives of this particular crisis. What I have found, quite frankly, is some of your best people may actually, if you will, not be able to handle certain situations as you go along. Secondarily, some people that you might have actually thought were fairly average, you may find exceeding your wildest expectations as we move forward because of the ongoing situation. Social skills are critical. Some people may get on edge. You got to insist on personal etiquette. And for yourself, once again, don't make any major decisions if in fact you are angry, if at all possible. And again, let's talk about optimism a bit more. This is an example of optimism going back to 1944. Dwight Eisenhower takes command of the preparation for the D-Day landings in December of 1943. In early March of 1944, he says to his staff, as you see here, this operation is being planned as a success. There can be no thought of failure, for I assure you there is no possibility of failure. An enormously complex situation, preparing for the invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944. The photograph you see there on the right is a bunch of young paratroopers in the 101st Airborne Division on the afternoon of the 5th of June, 1944, preparing to get on aircraft to go to France and parachute into occupied territory. Sadly, a significant number of the young men in that picture will be killed or wounded within 24 hours. The gentleman you see in the center, number 23, is Lieutenant Wally Strobel. And I met Wally Strobel one time, and I asked him, I said, what's going on here? How'd this all come about? Strobel told me an interesting story, and that was that they were all preparing to get on the aircraft, checking their weapons. Some guys were sleeping, some guys were playing cards, some guys were reading, some guys were writing a letter home. All the normal things you might think people might do when they're waiting to begin an amazing big operation. A guy runs into the particular Quonset hut where they were and says, hey, by the way, General Eisenhower's outside. Truth be told, these guys could actually care less about talking to Eisenhower right then. So they told this guy where he could go, take Eisenhower, and they could spend their eternity together, frankly. At that point, curiously, humorously enough, the guy said, you guys don't understand. He's got a dynamite-looking driver. And so these gentlemen have come out of their Quonset huts actually to see Dwight Eisenhower's driver, Kay Summersby. Then I asked Strobel, what exactly is Eisenhower saying? Is he giving you the win one for the Gipper speech? Actually, he told me all Eisenhower said to him was, where are you from? I said, sir, I'm from Michigan. And Ike said, you know, there's great fishing in Michigan. But by his mere presence, I would assure you that Eisenhower was providing that optimistic background music consistent with that statement that this particular operation was going to succeed. Oh, by the way, it was Wally Strobel's 22nd birthday. Now, in my research, whether you look at Coach K and what he said to teams when he was down a point or two with a couple seconds to go in the NCAA playoffs, whether you look at Ernst Shackleton, the famous British Arctic explorer, whose team becomes trapped in the ice in the Antarctic, Whether you look at the CEO of Starbucks after they had a crisis in the organization following the poor treatment of some people at one of their stores, or Johnson & Johnson during the Tylenol crisis, the one common thread for all those was the leader's optimism, coupled at times with brutal honesty with the group, is what got the organization through that particular difficult moment. Let's move on to the second one. How do you react immediately? What's our plan? How do you revise it? I like this quote by Mike Tyson. You know, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Well, you know what? We all just got punched in the mouth. Every one of you has got a crisis action plan. That plan is a good one, but it's generic, and you've got to review it right now and think about ways to adjust it. Waiting to decide is making a decision. You've got to be decisive. One of the first things you may want to do with your crisis action plan is to create a crisis response team on particular areas for your organization. You've got to be able to be willing to make decisions and do so quickly. You know, Colin Powell, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of the State, used to say, P equals 40 to 60. What was that? Probability of success of a decision. And what he meant by that was when you have 40 to 60% of the information you'd like to have, it's time to make a decision. If you constantly wait for directives from above, in this particular case, ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced you're falling farther and farther behind on an ever-evolving environment. Second of all, of course, you've got to evolve that plan once it's reviewed. No plan survives the first round fired, as we used to say. And here in a second, I'll talk a little bit about dealing with the media. But the bottom line in all this is you may want to consult that comment by former Mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, which is don't waste a perfectly good crisis. There may be an opportunity to make quick changes in your organization that you may have wanted to do all along, and now you have the reason to make those changes, streamline the organization, and move in the future. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is, as you see right now, as you see this guy repairing his organization as he flies it, is you have to execute while changing in a difficult environment. What are some of the things that you may want to think about? Well, one thing is, if you do not have a chief of staff position in your organization, you may want to create one, or at least empower somebody with that type of title who can oversee the transitions you're making to deal with this crisis and coordinate those through the various sub-elements of the organization to make sure you're capturing such things as how we transition to a remote work status and capture what we learn along the way and make adjustments that may be something you're going to be doing for a long period of time. You also may want to make sure your legal counsel is closely involved in changes that you're forced to make, or adopt legal advice if you do not have counsel readily advising. And finally, as you're adjusting that plan along the way, you've got to show a certain degree of patience once again by setting realistic goals for the group, communicating those clear targets to the team, and make sure they understand it thoroughly. Finally, in this particular area, you got to be prepared to deal with the media. I've got some experience in that now. Curiously enough, I've now been working for CBS radio and television for 17 years. And I'm convinced of a couple of things about an organization in a crisis. First of all, the picture you see on the left is not a good media strategy. And second of all, you've got to think about who is the face and the voice of our organization. Is that going to be you? Is that going to be your communication spokesman? Is that going to be the president or the chairman of your board? But I would think very, very carefully about who is the face and the voice of the organization and try to make sure we stick with that one person. Otherwise, frankly, I've seen this happen too often. The media will ask various people the same question, get slightly different answers, and describe that in talking about how your organization is reacting. Thirdly, it's critical, I think, at this particular moment that you think about how you manage social media. Most of you as organizations probably have a social media presence, either Facebook, Twitter, or something else like that. Who actually can post on your Facebook or Twitter account? Do I want to shrink the number of people that have access and can do that right now because it's so critical to use that particular mechanism, while not strangling its effectiveness in getting out information, but also making sure that there's a certain degree more of a filter? You don't believe that? Consider the false Hawaii missile alert, which went out on social media. It went out at 8:07 a.m. that morning via social media, and it was rescinded at 8:45. So it was out for 38 minutes. In those 38 minutes, they calculated afterwards, there were over 6,000 relevant tweets sent out about that particular message. That doesn't count the number of Facebook posts, LinkedIn posts, Instagram accounts, etc. One reason they couldn't bring it down more quickly, it is reported because the governor couldn't find his password to the state Twitter account. Furthermore, though, while you're looking at how you control your social media, you may also wish to expand your presence on social media if there are certain devices and certain apps that you're now not using, which might become effective. Resilience. How do we create a climate of innovation, initiative, and creativity at this particular moment? Well, in that regard, of course, resilience is the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. Exactly what we have going on right now. Empowerment is key, as well as dealing with those other things I mentioned already: innovation, initiative, and also accountability. And let me talk about each of those in a bit more detail. Empowerment is allowing people to experiment that will help the organization adapt to changing times, okay? We've got to empower people. Many of you have heard me talk about leadership in 4 directions: how people lead others who work for them, how people lead their boss, how people lead or are led by their peer groups, and how people lead themselves. And I think that's a very good formula to think about in terms of empowerment, because what you want to do is make sure that everyone is thinking about how they are leading from their particular position. If we talk about innovation, of course, according to Peter Drucker, a very famous organizational theorist, innovation is change that brings on a new level of performance. So it's not just the Wright brothers inventing the airplane, that's an invention, but the innovation was the use of aircraft to deliver the mail or to move people or cargo around the world. That was a new level of performance. And Drucker talks about innovation are new products, new processes, or new organizational structure. And those are critical during a crisis like this. What products you devise now will be unique to your organization. Many of you I know are in the field of education. And I would argue, back to that Chinese symbol, this is an opportunity for educational organizations to expand their understanding and learning of distance education. This is a tipping point, I would argue, for education using new and innovative ways of distance education. Think about new processes, that crisis action team or that chief of staff I mentioned a little while ago. But finally, of course, you can't just say to the team, hey, everybody run out and be innovative. How can I actually encourage that? Well, you got to strike a balance between innovation and those things that we're going to actually execute. Studies have shown that individual teams pulled together to think about particular aspects of innovation for the overall organization have the most likely positive outcome. This is further demonstrated in a fascinating book by Walter Isaacson called The Innovators, on how people have created organizations that are innovative. Other ideas I've seen have been creating structures that guide people's thought processes that serve to avoid straitjacketing everybody while allowing the organization at times to focus their particular efforts towards innovation. One example actually might come from Pedro Miranda, who's the CEO of Otis Elevator. What he did was create a website or a place on his website to gather innovative ideas and then decide which the organization was going to pursue. He called those innovation thrusts. This may require, even though at a difficult moment, how we identify additional resources that we might be able to put towards that processes. One unique example I saw one time was a school district that was trying to figure out how to be more innovative in using social media. They gathered together, believe it or not, a bunch of students, particularly juniors or seniors, and gave that task to a group of them, thinking, not surprisingly, that young people may be more innovative in using social media than people, for example, of my age. You got to encourage initiative, the ability to assess and initiate things independently. The airlines have done this pretty effectively in what they call cockpit cockpit resource management. How do we get everybody in the cockpit to think about what's going on and collectively bring together their expertise to solving the problem? Analyzing the mission, being aware of the situation, lots of communications, adaptability, decision-making, being assertive, and demonstrating a certain amount of leadership. Sometimes you can foster that adaptability, that initiative, that innovation by reminding people of what the organization mission is and having them use that as a touchstone as they think about where they might take action for the entire organization. But none of these will work if you don't think about this a little bit. Accountability. Are you going to be a heat shield? Because as you encourage innovation, as you encourage initiative, as you encourage creativity, all those things are not going to work. But as you see here, success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. Or as Robert Half said, the search for someone to blame is always successful. If you try to unleash that creativity in the organization, but then crush somebody when their idea goes astray, trust me, you'll be crushing the initiative and creativity in the organization. You've got to be the one to stand up as a heat shield and say, to my team, we did this together. I accept responsibility for it. We're not going to do that necessarily again, and move on from there. And furthermore, if you do that, that's another opportunity, I would argue, where you're going to enhance the trust that entire team has in you in future. Resources. What internal, external resources can I draw upon, and how do I think about time as a resource? Well, there's no doubt about it. Every one of you, me included, are thinking about the resources that are available to us. And certainly that includes people, money, and capital items. That seems self-evident. But quickly, when we think about people, we're going to talk about internal and external people for a second in a moment. And second of all, we talk about money. We all know we have money in organizations, but sometimes they're in different pockets. They're set up to go for a particular project. What are the things we cancel so we can devote resources, people, money, capital items to a new project based on the new environment that we're operating in? But we got to think very carefully about the use of resources, because clearly vision without resources is a fairy tale. Let me talk then about the last two a bit more, your network and that resource called time. Individually, each one of you, consciously or unconsciously, have built and maintained a network, and hopefully you're using it as this cartoon suggests. You know who they are. Those individuals outside your organization, or perhaps within the organization, but at a different school, different part of the corporation or whatever, that you can turn to, bounce ideas off, or ask questions, or people outside the organization, or perhaps the mentor that you turn to at difficult moments for his or her advice. Now's the time to take advantage of that individual network. Organizations have networks as well. Here's a comment by Howard Schultz. A very large organization, Starbucks. Much can be gained by enlisting partners and colleagues who are committed to the same goals. And those partner and colleagues he's talking about are organizations as opposed to individual. Because leadership's about convincing others in your organization to follow your vision. It's also about finding partners outside the organization, inside the community perhaps, that you can work together. Because as Amanda Settley said in her book, Agility, Advantage, and Fearless Growth, leadership is not just a matter of how can I motivate and develop and guide those who report to me, but also how can I enlist, inspire, and improve outcomes for partners outside my resource. Let me talk about that last resource, time, because to me it's oftentimes the most critical and the most inelastic. I'm finding right now I got a lot of white space on my calendar. A number of events we were doing have been canceled. How can I take best advantage of that white space? You know, I'm told that Sir Isaac Newton determined the theory of gravity while isolated during a pandemic in London back in the 17th century. And William Shakespeare wrote King Lear while isolated as well. So there are opportunities, but how can I best utilize that particular period of time? How can I prioritize and focus my effort? One way to start, I would say, is begin at the beginning. Look at the mission for your organization and think through, what am I doing, and is it really consistent with that mission or focused on the mission? You may find you're doing a lot of things which are great, but really aren't critical to that mission, which is what you're really all about. And last but not least, let's talk about meetings, because during a crisis, people want to have a lot of meetings. Well, you know what? Meetings are not actions. And as you see right there, I survived another meeting that should have been email. As you think about meetings, we're going to have to meet in a different way because we can't meet physically. I'd like to have this meeting right now in a large lecture hall where we could talk together and I could actually see all of you and talk to you, but obviously that's not possible based on geography and ongoing event. But you may need to do things like review the number of licenses and host seats that you have for video teleconference software for your organization. You may also want to review and remind your organization's members on online security protocols or about making critical phone calls if they're outside at all, which may be inappropriate. But all those things may be necessary in terms of how you think about meetings. I would also suggest you may want to think about appointing a meeting controller, believe it or not. Perhaps that's that chief of staff I mentioned a little while ago. This person is the person who keeps the agenda, keeps the meeting moving, takes notes on action to be taken, and sees that those particular actions are coordinated through sub-8 organizations of the overall organization. It should not be you, because if it's you as the leader, you will spend all your time trying to think about the agenda for the next meeting and not thinking more broadly where the organization is going and how you can focus on that. Relearning. Organizations have got to learn so they can apply to the future. How can I create new processes and capture new ideas for the future? I think we're all should be convinced of one thing right now. This is not what I would call a one-off event. Our environment has changed. How much it's changed and for how long is something we don't know. But the environment has changed. We're going to have to adapt to a new environment. But how do I capture those things we're doing in terms of processes now to make those more permanent? Well, you've got to relearn. You've got to take adaptive learning, generative learning, and become a learning organizations where people are continually expanding their ideas. Because as you see from Peter Singh, that's going to depend on how well your organization performs into the future. How do I build a learning organization, encouraging a learning organization, and capture ideas? One way of thinking about that is an old process called the after-action review. And as organizations go through crises or even routine events, I marvel at the fact that very few sit down and ask themselves these 4 questions at the very end of it. What were we trying to accomplish? What was our strategy? What did we do? Why did it happen that way? And how are we going to adapt or refine our execution for better outcomes so we can repeat our success or adjust for the future? It's not merely an opportunity to focus on performance, but serve as a catalyst for cultural change. And here's several corporations you see in the lower right-hand corner that do that. The big difference in this environment is it's not an after-action review process. It's an ongoing review process as you move swiftly, hopefully, and decisively to adapt for the new environment, but capture those changes which may be long-term and may actually color changes in the overall culture of the organization. Number 6, reality. What is the reality of our situation, frankly, and what is the worst case scenario? And this is the point where leaders, frankly, earn their paycheck. Probably the classic example of this is described by the so-called Stockdale paradox, created by Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was one of the longest held prisoners of war in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Stockdale created this particular paradox in thinking about philosophy, which he did a lot upon his return at Stanford University. And he said that the people in the prison camp who didn't survive well were those who began to think, well, you know, it's Easter and we'll all be home by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and they would still be in the prison camp. Those are the ones that didn't handle this well or frankly fell along the wayside. So the paradox he created is, as you see right there on the screen. First of all, retain the faith that you will prevail in the end and convey that to your team. We are going to get through this together regardless of how difficult it might be. Ladies and gentlemen, we together are going to get through the corona pandemic. At the same time, each of you have got to confront the most brutal facts of the current reality for your organization, whatever they might be. Think back to Eisenhower, that picture of him talking to those paratroopers and conveying to everybody the optimism that the plan was going to work. At the same time, Eisenhower had written out a memorandum that he was going to release to the press, and that particular memorandum said basically the following: the Normandy landings have failed. Everything that I could ask of the soldiers, sailors, and airmen that participated was done by them. Whatever failure occurred is my fault and my fault alone. He wrote that out, he stuck it in his wallet, and actually he forgot about it. And 5 or 6 months later, his enlisted aide found it, and you can see that in the Library of Congress, or the National Archives, I should say, in Washington once again. What is that all about? Well, that's reality, the leader confronting the reality of the situation with a certain amount of accountability, while at the same time conveying to the organization an ironclad belief that we're going to get through this. Finally, reassess and reflect. How are we doing as a team, and how am I doing? In essence, how are we all doing this together? How are we getting through this? And assessing that and reflecting that along the way. In terms of how the team is doing, what are the goals we've established? Are we moving along, making progress on those goals? Have we established the measurements whereby we can determine whether progress is being made? Are we making decisions quickly to discard those things that aren't working and moving on to other ideas that may actually give us the success that we desire? When you're making those quick decisions, you might think back to a comment made by one of my favorite old baseball players, Satchel Paige, who pitched in the Negro Leagues and made it to the major leagues right after Jackie Robinson in the late 1940s. Paige once said, you know, one of the things I've always got in my life is don't look back, something might be gaining on you. So as you make a decision, move on and don't reflect on what might have happened if that particular decision did not seem to go as well as you would hope. Certainly you as a leader have got to think about how am I doing and assess your own physical and psychological health. Think about proper diet. Think about getting some sleep. Think about exercise. And we're going to have a subsequent webinar that perhaps talks about those particular areas of stress management in a bit more detail. But once again, as I said at the onset, how long is this crisis going to actually last? We really don't know right now. But whether you're talking about these young women who I met at a MASH hospital in Iraq, or Eugene Cran sitting there at a control desk during Apollo 13, or these gentlemen evacuating somebody who's been injured in a mass shooting somewhere in the United States, each of them were under enormous stress. As I prepared to go to Saudi Arabia back there in 1990, after talking with that lovely wife, I remember talking to a psychologist, and I can't remember this day how I came about doing that, but he said to me something I have never forgotten, and that is, he said, the leader is accountable to consider his or her health and the team's health. So I asked him, how could you possibly say I'm accountable? And he went on to say, because you're going to have to make very difficult decisions in the coming days and weeks. And as a consequence, you've got to make sure you're at the best psychological, mental, and physical condition to do that. So you are accountable to do that along the way. Too oftentimes, leaders try to push themselves too hard and find themselves, losing a certain a bit of their edge as the crisis moves on. That also means, and this is the final point I'm going to make in that particular regard, we all may need to draw on our spiritual health and spiritual well-being. And I take some solace in this particular one right here. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not necessarily recommending religion. If religion with a capital S gives you solace, please pursue that. If religion with a small s, or values, or whatever you reach and put your arms around when times get tough, please do that. But I take some solace from this comment by good old Pope John the 23rd, when he said, it often happens that I wake at night, begin to think about a serious problem, and decide that I must tell the Pope about it. Then I wake up completely, and I remember that I am the Pope. And if John the 23rd can manage that, I think all of us can as well. Leadership may be lonely, but you're not alone. You're all in charge of fantastic organizations. You can all think of fantastic people who work for you, and each one of them is dying to make sure the organization does well at this difficult moment. Now, I've actually added one additional recommendation at the very end. And you may find this curious, but I would ask you to rejoice. Be optimistic. I am confident, just as Winston Churchill once said, we have not journeyed this far because we're made of sugar candy. We as Americans have been through a great deal and will be through this as well. Optimistic people, and I urge you to be optimistic in the face of this trial with your organization, turn out, based on studies that I have seen, to be happier and have less depression, critical at this moment, are certainly healthier with fewer diseases, also critical right now, are seen as better leaders, have stronger relationships, perform better under pressure, and are more successful. You know, you got to stay in touch with your team and those that are important to you. You need to have a call list or an email list and stay in touch with those people regularly. You know, I actually think that this term social distancing is totally incorrect. It is not social distancing. It is physical distancing for the obvious reason that we're talking about a contagious virus. But we are blessed in the 21st century by the technology we're using right now to stay in contact. And that social contact may be even more important as we move into the next days and weeks ahead. So take a moment every once in a while, take a deep breath, rejoice, be optimistic, kiss your wife, kiss your husband, kiss your family, and we will get through this. And the watchword is, we'll get through this together. If we can help you, please let us know. Please let us know what you think about this presentation. As I said before, we're going to have some subsequent ones. Next one is going to be actually on the 26th of March at 1 p.m. EST, Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. on the West Coast, which will focus on positivity and stress management in challenging times, taught by one of our faculty members, Dr. Chris Maxwell, up at Penn State University. And with that, let me turn this back. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, there we go. Forgive me again. And with that, let me turn this over to Tanya to give you a little description about how we're going to handle the question and answers. Tanya?
All right, give me just a second to get myself situated over here. And bring up these questions. So the first question we have, and what I'd like to do actually, if you all can bear with me for just a second.
Would you like to start?
Yeah, I just want to bring this down here, and I'm actually going to stop the sharing, and so that, here we go. Okay, so folks can see a little better. All right. So the first question was, I'm a school principal in a small district. My people look to me for decisive leadership, but my district is currently centralizing command on this issue. How do I meet the needs of my people in a crisis where everything is so new and fluid that leaders of our district do not feel comfortable allowing their site leaders to have autonomy?
Well, it's a tough question to answer, quite frankly, because I may go against the grain of the organization, but I'll give it a shot. One is we talk an awful lot about leading the boss, and perhaps depending on the relationship that you have or have established with the superintendent, you might want to have a quiet conversation with him or her to urge him or her to empower not only you, but other members of the organization to execute, as you rightfully point out, at a difficult time. Second of all, I come back to a comment once made by Admiral Grace Hopper. Admiral Hopper was one of the very first female admirals in the entire United States Navy. And what she said was the following: it's far better to ask for permission than to ask, or it's far better to ask for forgiveness, I should say, than to ask for permission. And therefore, within the constraints that you have, I would go ahead and make decisions and move on. Perhaps once that decision is made, keep my boss informed, because I firmly believe one of the worst things you can do is surprise people in your organization or surprise your boss. I was always a big believer in a doctrine of no surprises. But move on, unless we're talking about the devotion of enormous amounts of resources, in which case, obviously, you're going to have to solicit decisions from the boss. or you're talking about doing something extraordinary that would put your particular team, your organization, your school in a very different position than other teams, schools in the particular district. For example, obviously you couldn't close your school down if not all the schools in the district were closing. But to summarize, lead the boss, have a chat with him or her, try to seek more empowerment, and follow the admonition of good old Admiral Harper. At times it's best to ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission.
Okay, next one. How do you encourage innovation but not allow individual initiative and workarounds that create unintended consequences for the organization once the crisis is over? How do you avoid solving problems for the exception in order to prioritize the most important needs and impactful value adds?
Wow.
They got good questions.
They got good questions, yeah. Well, as I said before, you can't just stand up in front of everybody and say, okay, I want you all to be innovative. If you stood in front of any organization in America or asked a whole room full of CEOs, do you want your team to be innovative? Every single one of them would say yes. But the key variable, of course, is establishing, as you suggest, a climate that encourages people to do that. And the balance you've got to strike is between being innovative while at the same time executing what the other things you've got to do and executing whatever those innovations require the organization then to pick up. As I mentioned, I like the ideas that I've picked up. First of all, perhaps creating teams to focus on a particular innovation, which focuses the effort instead of being sort of scattershot across all different areas of what the organization is responsible for, number one. Number two, I saw organizations that created a website and encouraged people to come up with innovations while at the same time creating a process where we could screen through those particular innovations and pick out the ones that we were going to devote energy and resources to. Back to what that guy talked about, innovation thrusts. Number three, are there resources we can free up to give to people to have them try different things and to experiment? And oftentimes those resources perhaps can come from external sources. Can we take people from doing something and put them on a new task because the task they were doing has become perhaps non-doable in the current environment? Can we take advantage, if I'm in a school district, for example, of volunteers or my actual students to be innovative? Is there another organization in the community that I can work together on being innovative? And then last but not least, of course, you've got to be willing to accept failure. Mistakes will be made, particular innovations won't work. And you as the leader have got to be willing to accept the responsibility when those things don't work. If you are not willing to be accountable as a leader, you'll very quickly crush any form of innovation or initiative. And the final point you make about, which is a really important one, which is, are we innovating for something that is unique to the moment, or are we innovating for something that now is going to be long-term and actually may change our processes, procedures, or even our culture? And that's why I would argue, once again, you got to create that mechanism that is capturing those things we're doing different and making a determination now, or perhaps when things quiet down a bit, of what of those changes that we enacted are going to be ones that we're going to continue into the future versus ones that had to be done for the exigencies of that particular moment. And the reason I say that, and perhaps I'm being a little bit, less clear to you than otherwise, is because, as I said to you before, I think we all agree on one thing. The environment in which we're operating has changed. We're not going to go back to where we were on 31 December 2019. That environment is not, we're not going back there. How much it's changed, we don't know right now. We won't know probably for several months. So therefore, to decide which changes, which innovations we're doing are now going to be permanent versus temporary is just impossible to make at the moment.
We have one from Chris in Oregon. The other ones I didn't have names for, but Chris in Oregon says, I'm a team leader for a government agency that contains office and field staff. This disruption has significantly changed the work that the field staff will be doing and require more personal communication than normal to ensure accountability. How can I best find a balance between effective task tracking and seeming like a micromanager in this changed environment?
Well, I think the first thing you got to do is you got to think about how I communicate, obviously, in a different environment. And you probably, since you got field staff, you've probably taken advantage of video teleconferencing and other social media mechanisms, but you may need to expand upon that. I think this idea of creating a chief of staff, if you don't have one, or a person you may not call on that, who takes on that role during this difficult moment of transition, may help you in tracking those particular things, as you mentioned. Third thing, you need to talk and communicate to the group regularly about those particular tasks and make sure that the tasks are the ones that are essential for the moment. Let's have a little patience, make sure we're setting realistic goals that can be accomplished and make those manageable in terms of our keeping track of it. And then last but not least, of course, that has got to be balanced against resources. Do we have additional resources we can devote to tasks that are now more required? Are we going to remove resources from tasks that are not required at the time? And back to how we manage that particular communications and meetings will be essential in managing that important resource of time.
Can you quickly give a civilian example of a chief of staff? So
well, many civilian organizations have chiefs of staff. And what a chief of staff basically is the person who directly reports to the superintendent of a school district, the CEO of a corporation, or in a military organization, the commander. His or her responsibility is really the coordination in a military sense of the staff, or the coordination of sub-agencies. So if you take a general structure, I've got a marketing department, I've got an advertising department, I've got a production department, I've got a human resource department, I may have a legal department, I may have a buildings and grounds or a capital items department. So I got various, if you will, pillars in my particular organization. And the chief of staff's job is to make sure that those particular separate sub-agencies, sub-teams, if you will, of the overall organization are coordinating their efforts together to the longer term and overall goals of the organization. That should be done on a routine basis, but obviously a crisis compresses time and also compresses your focus into very specific tasks, and therefore that coordination function becomes more and more important because it helps you, for example, determine where should I devote additional resources and where can I move resources. It also, back to Chris's question, allows you to better keep track, I would argue, for the tasks and goals that you are adopting right now, based on the fact that you've examined your crisis action plan and you're adapting that crisis action plan to meet the specific needs of this ongoing corona pandemic.
Got one more question that we can take here. This is very specific, so get ready. What are the top 2 to 3 things a company that is affected by the crisis can implement to make an impact within 6 weeks?
Well, first of all, I would have to know what that particular company
This is Chris Littell, I can tell you.
Oh, it's Chris Littell. Hello, Chris. Well, Chris, you can probably answer this as well as I do, but I think the first thing the organization has got to do is sit down and think through how has this changed our particular environment for how we operate? Is it possible, depending on what we do, that we can do a work from home as opposed to work on site? Obviously, some particular organizations can't do that. It's just not possible. And as a consequence, how do we adapt to that particular thing? Second of all, I think we have to talk about our structure. How do we change our structure to meet the contingencies of this current crisis? That's why I mentioned before this chief of staff or coordinating function, a crisis action team, and how I'm capturing, if you will, the changes that we are making along the way that may actually then be longer term changes for the future. And then thirdly, because communications is so critical, because for an organization to succeed, the person in charge, as I said at the very onset, needs to reassure, be somewhat optimistic, while at the same time being credible, and at times brutally honest. And that's a particularly difficult balance to strike. The only way to do that is through recurrent and regular, I would argue, communications. Well, the problem is right now, we're in a different communications world. So what's the way that we're going to communicate? What are the recurrent communication mechanisms that we're going to use to make sure that we do that, so I can hopefully maintain that level of trust and credibility, if not expand it during this difficult moment, because that's going to be one of the key fundamental things that I can do to make sure my organization gets through this difficult time.
Okay, I think that covers all of our questions. So I'll come over here real quick and thank everyone for coming this evening. You have one more thing you want to mention? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for participating and joining us tonight. I'm flattered by your attendance, number one. Number two, we stand ready to assist you as we can as you work through this difficult time. You saw our website that was listed there. You'll also have availability of a recording of this particular presentation and an email address. Please feel free to send us a note on how you found this particular presentation in terms of being useful to you. And stand by. We'll also be sending out some additional information in future about coming presentation. Tom, it looks like we got a question from Tom Hunt. If we can take that, I'd like to do that.
Yeah, sure.
I
had a question submitted.
Tom Hunt's a special guy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. Yes. Okay. Thank you for letting us know. We'll take one more question from Tom.
Yeah.
As a school board trustee, one with a heck of a superintendent, we're looking for the balance where in this high-speed pace, the board wants to be involved, yet not be a hindrance to our district staff leadership. We collectively put away our elected office egos, yet find the balance that aligns with our constitutional oversight duties. Dr. Hansen is keeping us involved, board representation via board president, and or my own as VP involvement in the daily roundtable staff leadership meetings. How do we best support Dr. H and ensure that we are not left out, and as well protect him and them? Thank you, Tom Hunt. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, and greetings to Riverside.
Thanks very much, Tom, and please convey my warmest regards to that fantastic team out there in Riverside, California. I would give you the following thoughts, Tom, particularly for a school district of the size of yours, and I know your district pretty well. You're a team. To begin with, you've got a strong basis to start with, and that you're a team of strong trust. What I've found for any organization, particularly a school district, how effective that organization is, if it has a board, is going to be a function of the relationship between the board and the actual leadership of the organization. And I will say publicly, in this case, for your particular organization, there is strong trust both ways, so you've got something strong to build upon. I have sadly worked with organizations in which the relationship between the board and the leadership was antagonistic, and that's the recipe for disaster on a normal day, and certainly a recipe for disaster in a difficult moment like this. Therefore, trust is intense, important, and you've got a strong basis to build upon, number one. Number two, I come back to what I said before about the media. I think it's very important for you, and you've probably done this already, to have a conversation amongst the board, district leadership on when inquiries are made, particularly from the media, who is going to be the face and the voice of the organization to the best of your ability, so you don't get caught between someone said this and someone said that, and someone in the media trying to find the fissure between those two, number one. Number two, constant communication is going to be key in figuring out how you can do that by not wrapping you all into a straitjacket is going to be difficult, but very important. Do we depend on periodic meetings? Do we depend on we're going to have a conference call at a particular time every day or every other day? Do we depend on a particular social media device? How are we going to communicate and communicate on a regular basis? Communications will be key and essential for you to provide input to the leadership and for the leadership to keep you informed. And then finally, at times, you may have to, as a board, defer to the judgment of the person in charge and to stress to him that at this particular moment, you're going to give him maximum leeway. I said before, successful organizations are organizations that empower the members of their organization at a particular difficult time to make decisions and move out quickly. If there's board oversight, to some degree, the empowerment you provide to the leadership team you've got there in the district, which I think is a great one, right now probably ought to be a bit more broad than you would do on a normal routine day. That doesn't mean that you give up your total oversight responsibilities. You certainly cannot do that. That doesn't mean that the school leadership team doesn't have responsibility to keep you informed when they have to take decisions, perhaps more quickly than they might have otherwise done so during more normal times. No, all those things stay in place, but you may have to, with that oversight responsibility, give that leadership team a bit more leeway and flexibility than you did 6 months ago.
Great. I wanted to share something that Tom actually subsequently posted. This may be of interest. I know we have a lot of school district folks on. So Tom says that here in Riverside, we reached out to Lamar Outdoor Advertising, who will place our special messages on their outdoor digital boards at zero cost, since they're a nonprofit. I've known Lamar since the 80s here in Louisiana. So just a suggestion to the audience, he says that might be something to look into if you need to get messages out to folks.
And I might add, Tom, that's a classic example of what I was saying before about taking advantage of your network. Network in terms of organizational partners as well as a network of individuals. I also happen to know in your particular community, you've got a number of colleges and universities that you partner with pretty regularly. And there may be opportunities for your faculty to partner with them on distance education. There may be opportunities to partner with them in terms of, again, how to take advantage of particular social media items in terms of communications. But that whole idea of reaching out to partner organizations in the community as part of your network is key and essential.
All right, great. I think that's all the questions we're going to be able to take this evening. We have a lot of people in the chat just saying hello. So I just wanted to mention a few names so I don't have to type back specifically, but know that we see you and we hear you and thank you for being with us. But Rick Rochelle, Kenneth Weeks, Tom Hunt, obviously, Bill Spencer, Melody Douglas, thank you so much for your kind note. I will definitely pass that on to Jeff. Anna Luna from Corona Norco. Hi, Corona. Corona Norco, we're thinking of you. Chris Harris and Christopher Holmes, and then Sherry Eli. So thank you all so much for being here. We're sending you lots of love, lots of thoughts, and good luck to everybody. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Yeah, and I want to do a special shout out to my team, Tanya and Bree, because it was Tanya and Bree who formulated this particular idea. It was Tanya and Bree that did all the advertising and marketing. It was Tanya and Bree that put this all together so we could give this presentation this evening. And hopefully, if it is well received, we'll establish an opportunity for us to do more focused discussions on different aspects of leadership in the coming weeks. So thanks, big shout out to them.
Yeah, and last one. Hi, Lily Wu. Thank you so much for being with us. We're definitely thinking of you as well. So we're going to be ending it here. As Jeff said, you'll be getting an email tomorrow. Everyone who registered will be getting an email tomorrow with information on how to access the recording. So we'll have that up to you probably by noon tomorrow. So if for some reason you don't receive that, or it maybe ends up in your spam, just shoot us an email. We'll make sure that you get it. But look for it sometime between the morning and at least by noon. We should be able to get that out noon Eastern. So everyone have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, and God bless.
Bye.